Today's presentation from my side is going to be roughly in two halves. The first half, I'm gonna talk you through 10 areas, 10 big areas that we're seeing as both emerging important fields in China-Africa relations, places like areas where we're seeing a lot of development in China-Africa relations, particularly applicable to North Africa. But also where we're seeing a lot of misinformation. So, kind of in what we saw in the program is that, kind of there's kind of new trends and myths and all of these different aspects. But what struck me when I put the talk together was that in a lot of cases, all of these myths and misinformation and new emerging information and new trends, they're falling into into 10 roughly delineated areas. So I think I'm gonna like highlight both trends and some misinformation and myths and so on in each of them. I hope that's okay. And then after that, I will provide some suggestions of practical resources for places where you can find specific kinds of data, early suggestions for particular kind of experts that you might want to talk to, and then I want to open it for your questions, because I realize that some of the issues that you're dealing with are not issues that I would necessarily know, but that I'd be happy to address. So. Overall, when one looks at the entire Africa-China relationship, there are these kind of very kind of like big kind of meta narratives that we see about the relationship. And I think that's maybe a good place to start before we really kind of dive into these specific areas. So just so you know, the areas I'm looking at today are diplomatic alignment, diplomatic messaging, debt, the Ukraine crisis, peace and security, labor relations, party-to-party exchanges, climate issues, multilateral organizations, and internet and ICT provision. So we'll get to all of those, and I'll try and move through them quickly, but not too quickly. So when we look at the overarching relationship, there's a few assumptions I think that Africans make about what China actually wants from Africa and what it wants from the global South. When you speak with Africans about the relationship to China, frequently they assume that what China actually wants in Africa is resources. Kind of raw resources like oil, like minerals, like wood. That is to a certain extent true. Resources is a big, raw resources are a big part of the trade between Africa and China, but it's not as true as it used to be. So, kind of, and if you look at the early 2000s, then that was really what a lot of Chinese, kind of engagement with Africa was focused on. Focused on buying oil from places like Angola, for example, from Nigeria. And some of that is still going on. However, it's diminished a lot. The importance of raw resources to China in Africa has fallen a lot. This is for a few big reasons. One is that we now have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's global outreach initiative, and because China has been working very hard to build relationships between other parts of the global South. So in kind of in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, they now have a lot of options. So Chinese companies and the Chinese government, they're not in the position they were in the year 2000 in terms of like trying to find new sources of oil. They now have lots of sources of oil. So they're buying oil from all kinds of places. They're importing minerals from South America. They're buying agricultural resources from all over the world. So Africa is still important in that respect, but it's not nearly as important as it used to be. And since then, the relationship has also become a lot more complex. So what's a lot more important to China now is things like votes at the UN, like a community of countries that support China's growing position in the world, and a community of countries that are willing to see China as some kind of leader. And most of the time, this leadership is particularly in relation to development. So China, what China is increasingly looking for, more than resources or more than oil or so, is for agreement, like agreement among countries, agreement to honor China's position as a setter of new kinds of norms, and particularly countries that are willing to provide agreement to China's emerging bigger role in the world. So this is a kind of a big, complicated story, and a lot of this has to do with building influence throughout the global south because China is facing so much resistance in the global north. So, kind of as countries like the United States, like Australia, and its allies are becoming more and more anxious about the rise of China, so China is also trying to to gather support for its global rise all throughout the global south, and that is happening in many different areas at once. And those are the areas that I'm kind of unpacking for you today. So the first biggest one is this issue of development. What we've seen over the last few months, particularly emerging from discussions by Chinese academics, is that they're moving towards a new global strategy that's really focusing on putting development right at the center of their global influence building. And how they're articulating this is they're saying we're moving from a moment of international development into a moment of global development. So what they mean by that difference is the idea, the way that they define those terms. They say that international development is essentially classic north-south development. So it's this idea of like global north countries, like in Europe, kind of giving aid or giving kind of investments, or kind of trying to build trade with the global south. So it's the idea of development that we've gotten used to in the 20th century, and it's the idea of development that permanently that has a permanent power relationship between the global south and the global north. In classic traditional ideas of development, the global north will always be the more developed one. The global south will always be the follower. And therefore, the global north will always be setting the norms, and the global south will always be following the norms. Keep in mind that when China talks about itself in the world, it always talks about itself as a developing country. Now, obviously, for African countries, frequently that sounds like nonsense, and it's difficult for the country with the second largest economy in the world to think about itself as a developing country, but that is how China defines itself. And when you look at rural China, you see that there are, big parts of China still are quite underdeveloped, or they have development challenges that are similar to other parts of the global south. So what the Chinese are saying is that the current crisis, particularly the climate crisis, and the challenges we're facing, the technological challenges we're facing in order to deal with climate change, means that it's this kind of north-south development relationship doesn't work anymore. What we now are seeing is a global process of development where everyone has to kind of go into a new phase of development in order to deal with the climate crisis. So from China's position, they see their own history of development as this unique asset that they can then give to the rest of the world. They can provide examples, they can provide stories, they can provide, kind of all kinds of leadership in relation to development. And that is what they kind of see now, and that's what they see their position as now. And part of that is to then challenge the leadership of the traditional global north, of the United States, of other Western countries as development leaders. So if you think about the kind of the 1990s or the early 2000s, Western institutions set the rules for development, and they provided the money through institutions like the World Bank. And therefore, they kind of set the entire development model, and they had very strong ideas about what good development looked like and what bad development looked like. China is challenging all of that. They're challenging that entire kind of intellectual leadership of the West. And instead, they're talking about a new phase of global development that will essentially be led by China, and where buy-in and support and engagement with the global South lies at the heart of their entire global strategy. So this is one of the reasons why in my work, why the China Global South Project, which I'll introduce to you a little bit later, why we think it's so important to focus on China's relationship with the Global South, because it lies at the heart of China's entire global strategy. Okay, so we talked about development. Next one is, and very closely related to that, is diplomatic alignment. So what we've seen over the last few months, very, very intense diplomatic engagement, both in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and in the MENA region. So we've seen the Chinese diplomats, kind of moving to meet with African governments all over the continent, with Middle East governments, and connecting those kind of connections to also, for example, via organizations like the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, to also other parts of the global South, to Southeast Asia, kind of to other parts, to Western Asia, and so on. All of this is, this very intense form of diplomatic engagement is designed to build support, to particularly build support in forums like the United Nations, but also to build support and relationships between China and other regional organizations. So, so they're, kind of like multilateral organizations that I'll return to a little bit later. They are really key to this. They're particularly the UN is really key, and gathering votes from the global South, kind of in the UN is a really big priority for China. The next big issue is debt. So obviously, debt has been one of the biggest kind of like news stories in the Africa-China relationship for a while. China is a very big lender to Africa and to the whole global South, and now with the war in Ukraine, and with the post-COVID-19 pandemic, the pandemic and its aftermath, we're seeing that a lot of these countries are now falling into debt distress. So the Africa-China debt issue is a really complicated one, and it's particularly also one that's very, very vulnerable to disinformation and misinformation. So I would suggest to anyone who's reporting on this issue, there's a few key resources that will really help you in this work. And I'll introduce them to you like when I get to resources at the end. Thing to look out for is the most important trap is what we call the debt trap. There's been a narrative called what's come to be known under the shorthand of debt trap diplomacy. This idea that China on purpose indebts poor countries, and then when those countries can't pay back the loans, they then take assets. So in Africa, we've seen this panic in Uganda around the Entebbe airport, this idea that China is going to take the airport. The most classic example of this story is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, and you will see the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, or Entebbe airport in Uganda, or the Zambian Broadcasting Corporation. You'll see all of these examples, people raising these examples, and see that they couldn't pay the loans to China, and now China's taking this asset. Be very careful of that narrative. This is a kind of a disinformation narrative that has been put out by, or has been promoted. Particularly, it was strongly promoted during the Trump era and by the US. And none of these assets have actually been seized. In all of the cases, the issue is a lot more complicated. This doesn't mean that there isn't problems with Chinese debt in Africa. There are certain African countries have very big Chinese debt problems, and some of those loan contracts are very problematic. However, what I would suggest is for you to if you're reporting on this, is to really get deep into the story, and I'll give you some suggested people to speak to and suggested kind of resources to use. But what I would also suggest is looking for a few specific things. One is the contracts of any particular controversial loans. Keep in mind that a lot of these contracts have clauses that keep them a secret, and particularly also sometimes even keeps the existence of the loan a secret. However, in what we've seen is that it's been possible for government officials to leak some of these reports, and that has given us a lot more insight into the specific nature of this report. And some of you who work in investigative journalism will be doing some of this work. So I don't want to go on too long about this, but what I would suggest is looking at the contracts, seeing, trying to find the contracts, and knowing that, that you can use, in some countries, you can use freedom of information requests to get them. And then in the second place, compare them to Western contracts, particularly not Western aid contracts, but Western commercial loans. This is because Chinese kind of lenders tend to draw on Western commercial law to set up these contracts. None of these are unique. Almost all of this is based on Western legal rules and legal customs. But also they also use Western lawyers frequently. So they come with Western legal teams frequently from New York or London, and they frequently use Western commercial law as the basis of these contracts. So it is possible to do comparisons between Chinese lending and Western commercial lending, and to also look, and there Zambia is a great example, is to look at the way that Chinese debt interacts with other kinds of commercial debt, particularly Eurobond debt. So this is a very deep, there's a deep issue. There's a lot of issues, a lot of complexities there, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But in case you need help with debt-related reporting particularly, please reach out, and Bogaway can put you guys in contact with us, and and we can put you in contact with a lot of people who can help you with this specific issue. Okay, so moving on, Ukraine. Not that much to say about Ukraine, but the big thing to keep in mind about Ukraine is that China is increasingly using Ukraine as a kind of a way to gather support throughout the global south, particularly as by focusing on the economic impact of the sanctions rather than on the invasion itself, and also by focusing on the pressure that Western countries are putting on global South countries to support their position in the Ukraine crisis. So all of this, China is using this essentially as a way to kind of gather, again, as I mentioned, to gather diplomatic support, and particularly to gather support for alternative groupings outside of a Western-led grouping. So, how much of a problem you think that is depends on your own background and your own political leanings and so on, but that is what we're seeing. That is the kind of the dynamic that we're seeing. So what lies at the heart of China's position within the Ukraine crisis is a set of its own preoccupations, which is worries about Western power, worries about what that's going to imply for China's future, amalgamation with Taiwan. All of these issues are China-specific issues, but the way that they kind of get framed in the international press is via this kind of issue of Western pressure, or the kind of Western, kind of undue pressure from Western countries on sovereign nations in the global south. So, that's what we're seeing at the moment. Moving on to peace and security, peace and security is a really interesting developing field. What we saw recently, a few weeks ago, is that China, less than a few weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago or so, was that China was setting up a peace conference in the Horn of Africa. And China is increasingly interested in moving into this kind of peace and security field, particularly as part of what Xi Jinping has called the Global Security Initiative. So the Global Security Initiative is twinned with another initiative called the Global Development Initiative, and those are two these big initiatives of trying to provide alternative ideas of security and alternative ideas of development that stand in contrast to Western ideas of security and development, and also particularly in contrast to Western strategic objectives, like in Ukraine. So what China wants from all of these things is, as we said, diplomatic support and ideas, support for China's norm setting through the world. But what they also want is more experience, particularly more combat experience. And for that reason, one sees a lot of Chinese support for UN peacekeeping initiatives in different parts of Africa, in South Sudan, historically, for example. And part of what they're gaining through that is simply experience for their soldiers. Keep in mind that China plans around in the next 10, 15, 20 years to reunite with Taiwan in some kind of way. And so and Xi Jinping has also beefed up the Chinese army and the Chinese security architecture very, very strongly over the last few years. So all of this, what China is getting from all of this is increased combat experience, increased strategic experience, and at the same time building diplomatic support in places like Africa. Okay, moving on to the next one, party-to-party exchange. What we see, this is also really interesting. So Alina Ben Abdallah, who presented yesterday, she's an expert on this kind of exchange, and also on the use of training to build diplomatic support in Africa. So she's a great person to speak with on that. So what recently they started what they call a party school in Tanzania, and this is essentially, it was supported by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's a way of training, using the experience of the Chinese Communist Party to train party officials from at the moment 6 different African countries. One Tanzania, one South Africa. I'm blanking on the other 5. But the idea is that. So Chinese diplomacy runs on 2 tracks, right? They do the normal diplomacy, country to country diplomacy that everyone does, but they also have a party to party diplomatic track. And what we've seen recently is that China does a lot of party outreach, so training and capacity building for different political parties. And what they essentially do there is to build contacts and to familiarize Africans with China's own development story, and keep in mind that China's development story is framed in China as having been party-led. So China's economic development and China's massive economic success is framed as the success of the Chinese Communist Party. And so therefore it's shown, this is party-to-party exchange is also a way for party officials in Africa, or political officials in Africa, to then gain from and to get used to the Chinese party story of their own development. So it's also a form of for the Chinese, this is also a form of risk mitigation. So they're always worried about political changes in Africa, and so they try and set up contacts with parties, frequently ruling parties, but also actually opposition parties sometimes. So that if they're particularly in key countries, so that if there is a big election change over where a new party comes into power, China already has good relationships with the new party coming into power as well. So their party-to-party exchange goes beyond ruling parties sometimes to include opposition parties. Okay, all of this I've been speaking a lot about diplomatic engagement, and I want to move or I'm almost done with these points, and I want to move to concrete tools soon. Kind of towards the end there, multilateral organizations are really, really important. They're becoming even more important now. So this is the UN in the first place. So China's very interested in the UN, and they've been really putting a lot of energy into all kinds of work with the UN, and particularly also supporting Chinese personnel and agency and department heads within the UN. And African support for that and African votes in the UN has been really important for China. Like from its independence, and getting it the UN seat originally in the early 1970s, African nations were key to that support, and they've remained key to that support up to now. So that's a really important thing to look out for, is that kind of diplomatic influence building. Then also, China is very worried about other forms of other kind of blocks, particularly led by Western countries, that they see as ways to kind of hedge China in, or to kind of to keep China in a box. So those include the NATO, particularly now around Ukraine. It includes what's called the Quad, which is Australia, the United States, Japan, and India. This kind of strategic grouping, and for that reason, alternative groups like, for example, the BRICS group, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now they're planning to enlarge by perhaps pulling in Argentina, perhaps Indonesia. They're still talking. Those kind of alternative blocks are really important to China. So to try and kind of balance this, what they see as something like NATO's, kind of like pushing of Western influence. So over the next few years, you're going to see even more energy, I think, going into multilateral institutions, and particularly, so there you can see something like FOCAC, or China's engagement with the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, for example. All of this kind of work fits into that anxiety about building influence. Finally, is internet provision. Like always look out for how internet provision plays out, so the kind of political messaging that gets put on internet provision, both from the Chinese side and from the Western side. Internet provision has become a really kind of like fraught issue, and it's particularly one where we see the development choices of global South countries really kind of starting to get a lot of pressure from both sides, and that, I think, it's really important for global South journalists to make that clear. I think to their populations, it's like these development choices, particularly around 5G and other kind of internet provision, is getting a lot of pressure both from China and from the United States. Then I just want to move on to talking about more specific resources.
كوبوس بقي
Yes.
سوري كوبوس بقي 3 دقائق فقط لديك لإكمال هذه المداخلة. لننتقل بعد قليل إلى أسئلة الصحفيين قبل أن نمر للجلسة القادمة.
Absolutely, I'll be very quick. Would it be okay if I shared my screen quite quickly? So let me just see if I can do that. I might not be able to. Okay, so what I wanted to introduce you guys to the China Global South project. So what we do is we track everything that China does in the Global South. We started specifically focusing on Africa, and increasingly what we're doing now is to do comparisons between Africa and the rest of the Global South. So we have resources in English. We started in English, but we also have a site in French, and we have a site in Arabic. So we'd be more than happy to provide you with contacts both in French and Arabic. And also we'd be more than happy to promote your work once it's been published, kind of in these languages, and also to help you, kind of with moving from one language to the other. So we're very dependent on this work from journalists, and we want to really support this work, kind of by journalists also. So, so Arabic, French, and English, we were available in all three of those languages. Then I would suggest, if you are interested in speaking about debt specifically and about all of these like really complicated issues around Chinese loans to Africa, I would suggest 3 resources. One is called the China-Africa Research Initiative. They are one of the world's preeminent, kind of research bodies on debt, and they give fantastic, broken down, fine-grained data about Chinese lending to African countries, which you can look at country by country, you can look at it sector by sector. They have amazing these kind of like interactive databases and interactive maps that you can use, and they're incredibly useful. All of the scholars who write on China-Africa debt issues use their work. Also, equally amazing is Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. So that's the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Previous one, the one that I mentioned before, is the China-Africa Research Initiative, so CARI. They also, Boston University's GDP Center, they do also very, very fine-grained work on lending. They have massive databases on Chinese lending to Africa, but they also do a lot of comparative work with Latin America. So if you want comparative perspectives, like looking like this is happening in South America, but this is happening in Africa, what's the same, what's different, they're very, very useful. Then there's a third research center called Aid Data. So that's AIDDATA, so Aid Data. They do particularly work on Chinese loan contracts. They're the world's leading experts on Chinese loan contracts, and they do a lot of this work, this kind of forensic investigation about these secrecy clauses in debt agreements. So they're incredibly useful. You could also find interviews with all of these people on our podcast. So if you do understand English, there's 700 episodes of podcasts discussing all of these issues in incredible detail on our website. Then finally, I would suggest, if you're interested in the issues around if you're interested in African perspectives on China and the impacts of Chinese development, I would suggest 3 think tanks to you. One is the Afro-Sino Center for International Relations. That's ASCIR. They're in Ghana. They provide like West African perspectives on these issues, and then 2 in South Africa. One is the South African Institute of International Affairs, that's SAIIA, and the Institute for Global Dialogues, IGD. But they do a lot of work, but please also feel free to just contact us and and raise any questions with us directly. Thanks so much. Sorry for going a little bit long.
شكرا كوبوس. شكرا لك كوبوس. لقد قدمت لنا نظرة شاملة عن العلاقات الصينية والإفريقية فيما يخص التنمية، الديون، الأزمة الأوكرانية، علاقات العمالة، وأيضا العلاقات السياسية مع الأحزاب. وإذا كان من الممكن أن تشاركنا هذه المصادر كتابيا التي كنت تتحدث عنها، وسنشاركها لاحقا مع الصحفيين، ستكون مفيدة لعملهم الصحفي الاستقصائي. أتوجه الآن بالكلمة إلى الصحفيين والصحفيات المشاركين معنا في هذا اليوم، خاصة وأنهم اشتغلوا، كانوا في صلب هذا الموضوع واشتغلوا على المواضيع والتي كنت تتحدث عنها. مثلا راقية، وهي صحفية استقصائية تونسية، تحدثت في تقاريرها عن المشاريع الضخمة في إطار مبادرة الحزام وطريق التي لم ترى النور بعد. وأيضا توفيق من الجزائر، والذي تحدث عن الصين والجزائر من العمالة إلى التعايش، وياسر الذي تحدث عن المبادلات الثقافية وتطور الرؤى الشعبية بين الصين والمغاربة. إذن ياسر أو توفيق أو راقية، إذا كان لديكم تدخل أو بعض الأسئلة تفضلوا من فضلكم، أفتح المجال لكم. أظن أن راقية لديها مشكل في الميكرو وقد أرسلت سؤالها عن طريق الكتابة. يتمثل سؤال راقية في أن هل تعتبر مبادرة الحزام والطريق استراتيجية الصين لكسب المزيد من الدعم الإفريقي لها ضمن المنظمات الأممية؟ هل سؤالي واضح كوبوس؟
Yes. Yes, like I think I think to a large extent, I think China was to a certain extent, or the way that I see it, China was a little kind of caught unawares, I think, by the invasion. But since then it's moved into trying to turn that crisis into an opportunity for itself, and the particular way has been to gather support throughout the global south, particularly in relation to the economic impact of the conflict. So the narrative that we're seeing from the Chinese side is that this is a small European conflict that is now being made everyone else's problem. And that the issue really actually is sanctions and and the economic impact of the sanctions particularly. So I mean, one could agree with that or not agree with that, but that has been the kind of the messaging that we're seeing from China on this issue, and they've used it as a way to gather the kind of support throughout all of these global south countries, that because they realize that these global south countries are all now suffering economic problems, kind of due to the disruptions in Ukraine. So that has been from our perspective what we've seen.
أوكي، شكرا كوبوس. أرجو أن تكون الإجابة كافية ووافية بالنسبة لك راقية. أمرر الكلمة سريعا إلى ياسر. تفضل ياسر، رفعت يدك. ياسر هو صحفي جزائري.
مغربي ولا
سوري، مغربي سوري ياسر.
مرحبا روعة. شكرا كوبيس. أنا شخصيا ليس لدي سؤال، لكن ما أثار انتباهي بعد الشكر، أنا استمتعت كثيرا بمحاضرة الأستاذ كوبيس. موضوعي الذي اشتغلت عليه كان بعيدا عن الاقتصاد وعن ما يتعلق بالديون بالمبادلة التجارية، كنت يعني موضوع ثقافي عن المبادلة الثقافية. لكن ما أثار انتباهي هو حديث كوبيس دائما: إذا كنتم مهتمون بكذا فسأزودكم. أنا أقول لك أستاذي كوبيس، نحن مهتمون بكل ما ذكرت. شخصيا يستهويني المواضيع الاقتصادية، تستهويني صحافة البيانات والتقصي في هذا الموضوع. أنا مهتم بكل ما ذكرت، في انتظار عمليا إجرائيا، في انتظار أن تمكننا من كل المصادر والأدوات التي تحدثت عنها. شكرا جزيلا مرة أخرى، وأنا مستمتع بالمحاضرة طبعا.
شكرا ياسر على المداخلة.
Thanks so much. And yeah, we'd love to hear more about that work on COVID. And also from my side, I would also, if anyone is interested in tracking Chinese vaccine deliveries to the world and to Africa particularly, there's a great consultancy called Bridge. It's like Bridge Beijing that track Chinese vaccine deliveries, sales and donations to the rest of the world. Very, very useful in case you want vaccine numbers.